Suemnicht.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading an article called Vital Cells by Kevin Suemnicht that was published in December of 2021. I don't know, I kind of picked this one out because it felt like a nice follow-on from our reading of Anarchist Cybernetics, in that this is also an article that comes out of the anarchist and kind of autonomous milieu that levels its critique against the milieu and kind of implores everyone to pick up cybernetics, which all of that works for us. Straight up our alley.
Yeah, I think it's on the same page as us in that regard. It does seem to come more out of the autonomous side of things than the anarchist one, which is, for people who aren't familiar with the distinction, autonomism is a tradition that comes out of Marxism and is on the sort of far left of Marxist thinking, heavily influenced by Deleuze and influenced by ideas of self-organization among workers. Although, for some autonomists later on, they kind of drop the category of worker altogether. But yeah, essentially, they kind of come to a similar place as anarchists, even though they're coming at it from a Marxist background. So there's a lot of sort of Marxist theory that goes into autonomism, which you may not necessarily get in anarchism, which has its own kind of intellectual background that it's drawing on. But yeah, they have a lot of common ground with each other, despite coming from different backgrounds.
Yeah. Is autonomism still that much of a thing, or did it all melt into communization?
I don't think communization and autonomism are really the same thing. Like, my left-com knowledge is not 100% there, but yeah. From what I understand, autonomism, it's very interested in this idea of the social factory, where the whole society is the location of class struggle. It's very interested in this idea of the multitude, where it's the idea is sort of that we all already are latently living in communism already. If we were just to manifest it, then we would be in communism. The potential is all entirely there already. We just have to become the multitude, and then we can be communist, instantly, kind of thing. Whereas I feel like communization theory has this sort of kind of insurrectionary bleakness about it that I don't really associate with autonomism. It's on the one hand, in autonomism, you have the sort of grand theory stuff, which is all about this kind of inherent potential, this sort of Spinoza inherent potential for communism that's just always there and can manifest. And they do have a background in actual factory organizing from when they were originated in Italy. And the other side of autonomism that sort of comes out of that is a lot of ethnography of workers, looking at organizing efforts in shops, in factories, in call centers, in all of these places, and trying to find evidence of worker self-organization and that kind of movement towards being multitude. So it's very much there's the high theory side of it and there's this ethnographic side of it, and both of them are very important to what autonomism is. But I feel the stuff out of communization is more the high theory side, and then they kind of I guess in a way similar to autonomism, sort of pick examples of particular uprisings or demonstrations, or I guess as our fellow network member Ezri's called them, tantrums, to sort of support their theory. It's communization doesn't strike me as having the same kind of like ethnographic, detailed micro level on the ground analysis as autonomism does.
Yeah, certainly. So this article comes out of the autonomous kind of tradition, but it's really critical of it, and it's kind of, as we said at the start, it's like kind of saying, hey, look, we've kind of dropped the ball on organizing and actually getting things done. Like our kind of quote tantrums don't actually seem to really go anywhere. Maybe we need to rethink stuff. So I'll just read a little bit here. So quoting from the article, "For too long, the anarchist and autonomous movement has refused an intensive and protracted theoretical debate on organization, with the result that our thinking on the matter has remained in a state of self-incurred infancy. Where this debate did occur, it often found itself trapped within a sterile opposition between formality and informality that is as fallacious as it is reductive. Although many of us correctly identify the obsolescence of principal models handed down to us by the 20th century, we want neither one big union nor the classical cadre party of Marxist antiquity. Our prevailing mode of organisation, herein referred to as the milieu, is severely lacking. Are there other organisational forms that remain untried?" And the answer to that bit then is yes, there is, and they're going to propose a shift in thinking via cybernetics, which this is wonderful because it's right up our alley, and it's always just nice to know that we're not totally alone in thinking about this stuff.
Yes, I agree. Like, I think that their diagnosis of the situation is similar to ours, and their appeal to cybernetics for solutions is also very similar to ours. So I think we have a lot of common ground there for sure. I do have critiques of this piece, but I think that like they're working towards something similar, that we're doing, and people we work with are doing. So that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. It's good to see. I mean, I think it's pretty good overall. It's like the way I'll kind of put my general kind of critiques is that like a lot of stuff I encounter coming out of autonomism and a lot of anarchist writing and stuff always kind of rings a bit hollow and seems to be kind of contentless. You know, it has a lot of ethical assertions and a lot of rah-rah to the barricades kind of feel-good stuff, but it seems to have very little substance. This article is vastly less hollow than most of the stuff I'm accustomed to from there, so it gets my thumbs up for that. It is much more substantial than what I'm accustomed to reading from this. Yeah,
I think that. So the problems I've had with autonomism are like my first introduction to it was by reading Hart and Negri, their books like Empire, Multitude, etc. And Multitude was just like so out to lunch, like it was hard to take it seriously at all. Like it was, they just go on and on about things like, well, Marx always talked about revolution being like a mole, but our revolution is like a snake, and like we gotta ride the snake, and it's like, this is just like weird shit that you would airbrush on the side of a van. It's like this isn't any revolutionary theory I could actually do anything with.
Cool heavy metal album cover shit,
Yeah, pretty much. It's like the sort of like, just kind of like jammin', riffin' nature of it, like, was fun, but not something I would ever take seriously as like a political theory text. But then there's the other side of autonomism, which I mentioned, that kind of ethnographic side, and it always seemed to me to be, I guess that like Writing for Deliveroo book that we covered on the show earlier would be a good example of that kind of scholarship. Where it's like, yeah, this is really interesting. It's cool to see, like, at this micro level, how organization actually happens, how people actually come together. But it doesn't, like, exist within a kind of strategic context. And the strategic context is something that, like, autonomists just kind of didn't want to think about, in my experience, of like, it's like, okay, so, like, you know, this Starbucks is organizing and this is how it's going down, and, you know, this is how people are raising consciousness, this is how people are working together, how they're subverting the boss, like, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, but what is that going to do about, say, like, the massive draconian program of social service cuts and, like, gentrification in this entire province or country? Or, like, what does that have to do with, like, you know, the broader context of this Starbucks? There's no answers there, except for if you go to, like, Heart and Negri, where it's like, well, you just got to ride the snake. So, like, it's like, you know, simultaneously too abstract and too concrete was the kind of problem that I had with autonomism. And this is trying to kind of think that intermediate level, which I do appreciate a lot, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. So the author kicks into things with pulling a really good one out of the hat, Gregory Bateson, with the Cybernetics of the Self, which was written kind of inspired by Bateson's observations of the organizational structure of Alcoholics Anonymous, which feels like a real out there sort of pull, but there's something really good here. I think it's like Bateson's kind of quoted as like thinking of the AA stuff as like a kind of cybernetic epistemology that kind of begins from acknowledging the failure of like just pure will to overcome a problem. That like you can't beat addiction through sheer self-will, right? And the trick then with like the AA is that people who are recovering like kind of surrender their what's the word they actually use? Is it surrender? Yeah, I want to get this as right as I can because I don't have direct experience with AA. I have some experience with observing from a distance, but for listeners, we're going to try to do this as sensitively as we can, but we're not experts, so.
Yeah, my background with 12-step programs is that my father has used various 12-step programs as a venue for therapy and self-therapy for decades now. So I've had quite a bit of exposure to 12-step programs, but I haven't had the experience of firsthand participation. So it's a secondhand kind of experience. So I can't speak to it as somebody who's been through the whole process.
Yeah, we're going to try our best though. But the idea here is that like going from just trying to will your way out of it, right? Going from there to 12-step program is kind of using this. It's like a cybernetic, like a systems technology of like relinquishing some of your will and putting yourself into a system that perpetuates sobriety by deactivating an obsessive relation with the self. Which, yeah, it's good stuff. And like the author here is going to kind of use this as a way of like kind of pivoting out of the anarchist and autonomous kind of obsession with like small scale, like individualist and like sheer will sort of ways of trying to organize, and to really pitch for like, no, we really should have structured like systems that actually perpetuate the thing we want, right? Because it turns out that's how you get what you want, basically. Like if you want to get sober, you insert yourself into a system that perpetuates sobriety. You withdraw yourself from a system that perpetuates the addiction.
Right. So like, it's kind of a response to those sort of like op-ed or like listicle pieces you see all the time online, where the main thrust of it is like, well, I would simply not be addicted. Like I would simply stop drinking. Like, somebody who's not an alcoholic talking about alcoholism, or somebody who's not experiencing the condition they're describing or has not experienced it, saying like, well, why don't you just stop? It's like with ADHD, it's like, well, why don't you just focus?
It's a load-bearing just,
That is, it's like when that is, yeah, exactly. The just there is like doing magical work of erasing the problem that it's meant to address.
And the problem being structural, right? That you're in a feedback loop. You're in the case of addiction, your brain and your nervous system is trapped in a feedback loop, and the way out of it is to break the feedback loop, which is breaking a lot of structural stuff, and doesn't really have that much to do with the will of the individual.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that this is something that I've observed to some degree in like Buddhist meditation practices as well, right? Where it's like the way to achieve a higher state of consciousness is not to become attached to your goal and will it into existence, because then you're already sabotaging the thing that you're trying to achieve. So you have to maintain this kind of alternative relationship to your goals in meditation and in terms of self-transformation. Is you can't say like, oh, I'm so stupid. I like, why can't I just be enlightened? Like, why can't I just, think better? Like, why am I so obstinately obsessed with this? But then it's like you have to step back and realize that pattern of recursive thinking is already yourself engaging in an attachment and engaging in a lower mode of consciousness. So yeah, it's a similar kind of problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there was something very, it's probably something worth foregrounding here, right? That like, the reason the author seems to be digging this particular hole is because of that concept of like healing and like self-regeneration and like building your capacities, right? Like that's what you're doing in AA, and that's his kind of diagnosis of what we need as like individuals and as movements to like kind of like shift into a system that would actually perpetuate growth and meaningful healing and increase in our capacities. And like he's kind of looking back on the last couple of decades with the movements and stuff and being like, hey, this shit hasn't worked out. Like we're not gaining capacities by doing this stuff. We're not like, we just seem to be endlessly burning out and stuff. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that,
And it gets back to that sort of like Spinozist outlook of autonomism, where essentially like we all have these incredible capacities to be more than we are within us at all times, but they are suppressed by I forget exactly what the terminology that like Deleuze and Guattari used, but like it's something like the sad
passions.
The sad passions, yes. The sort of the mobilization of the sad passions to make us less than what we are at a kind of imminent level, right? That like it's not that we have to, in a sort of Aristotelian sense, like grow and flourish into what our telos is. It's that we already are those things that we associate with flourishing. It's just that those things are being like obscured or suppressed or saddened or weakened by these pathological machines that exist in our society, right?
Yeah. The author is also very impressed with the structure of the AA as something inspirational for movements, right? Like for organizing. Because like the AA doesn't have like a central authority. It's highly distributed. There's a lot of variety between like groups, but there's a kind of common ground in the commitment to the 12 steps and the 12 traditions.
This was a thing that I sort of wanted to push back on a bit, because I don't think that AA groups are actually high variety. I think they're quite low variety, actually, because the thing about 12-step programs is that they have a very specific purpose. Like this is our user base. This is what we are trying to achieve. This is the specific problem that we are working on. And if a 12-step group, like an AA group, becomes about dealing with a problem other than the one it was founded to deal with, it will fork into another 12-step program that is about that problem rather than diluting its focus, which suggests to me that actually the 12-step groups are quite low variety, and they have this protocol, like to, bring up the sort of protocols that we're going to be talking about later on, to deal with variety attenuation, where if it's like, this is outside of our project scope, then we're going to fork it into a different project. And that's not a criticism of 12-step programs. That's actually saying, well, this is a functional solution to the problem. Is like, rather than becoming a higher level organization that manages a variety of different problems, they just become a separate organization that deals with a separate problem, with a similar protocol. Yeah,
that's certainly the case, right? Like, that's interesting because like they'll have a like at the like System 5 like policy identity level, there's a kind of laser focus that, you're right, like it trims the variety of the problem by just fucking excluding so much stuff from consideration. It's like, no, we have this laser focus on this thing, and that's definitely something worth bearing in mind, right? That like, is it that these things are so effective because they are so narrowly focused, and we'd have to be then quite cautious about transplanting the model onto things that are more nebulous, such as like, we don't like capitalism,
Exactly. That is my main point of hesitation about this proposal. I think the author may be mistaking the sort of organization that these organizations are, because like for instance, my father started out in Codependence Anonymous, and now he's a member of Al-Anon, which is like a kind of like a support organization to AA, where it's about family members of people who are alcoholics or have suffered from alcoholism getting together and doing their own support as members of a family that has alcoholism in it. So it's like, if you're strictly speaking an alcoholic, you shouldn't go to Al-Anon. You should go to AA. And if you're not an alcoholic, but you're related closely to one, you shouldn't go to AA. You should go to Al-Anon. So it's pretty like, I wouldn't say that, you know, in a meeting, in a 12-step meeting, that the subject of conversation is strictly prescribed, but they do try to maintain as much as possible a focus in terms of what sorts of people come to participate, based on a common mode of suffering that they're going through. And I think that helps, not because it means that, like, the conversation is very low variety, or because it has, like, a super specific problem that it's addressing. Like, say, you know, I don't know, you go to a notary public exclusively to get documents notarized, right? Like, that's a hyper-specific reason that institution exists. I don't think that 12-step is low variety on that order. It's that when you're inserting yourself into this system that perpetuates sobriety, it helps to have other people who are walking the same path with you. And that variety attenuation is quite important. So that makes it an open question in terms of, is the problem set of living with capitalism sufficiently specific for this model to work, for, you know, revolution?
Yeah. That seems really crucial, right? Like, I'm racking my brain here and trying to, like, think, does this sort of thing come up in Beer's work? Because, like, he does talk a lot about like high variety channels, low variety channels and stuff, but, like, there's
this does come up to the degree that when you're doing a VSM diagnosis, you have to think quite hard about what the system ones of your organization are and what the roles are that they're fulfilling. And that is a kind of variety attenuation that I think is similar to the way that 12-step groups tend to fork off of each other in terms of saying, oh yeah, this is a function, this is a function, this is a function. And this is a kind of identity, even if it is an extrinsic one in the way that they describe in this article.
Yeah. The particular thing I'm trying to rack my brain for is, like, this thing where like a kind of viable organization actually uses, in some cases, extremely low variety, like kind of 1-bit variety guillotines to carve off huge tracts of space that it's just not going to touch, and that's helpful for it. Or maybe it's related, but, like, the thing where a recovering alcoholic will just refuse to go anywhere near anything that could even have a risk of exposing them to the stuff, and so that's like a kind of very, very tight filter that is adaptive. Like, is like, I guess it's maybe something that's slightly counterintuitive in Beer's framework, perhaps, that, like, extreme low variety channels can actually be adaptive in these cases.
Yes, I think we get a little bit of that discussion in the talk about meta languages in Brain of the Firm, right? The descriptive power of each level of operation being more elaborate as you go up and less elaborate as you go down. But I think that the reason why, the other thing I think that would be relevant to is the definition of metrics in System 2, where you want to, like, you know, Beer's very insistent on that point about, you don't want all the data about all the things. You want the relevant data to your purpose, and you want it to be clear. So don't overwhelm yourself with an infinity of statistical models. Just make the model that works for what you are doing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think that, on the other hand, though, Beer's model is meant to be one that can apply to organizations that can handle a maximum amount of variety, and so it isn't exclusively focused on this kind of solution, right? It's actually meant to have these specific purpose solutions within a general purpose solution.
Sure, gotcha. Yeah. And I guess the interesting thing here is that the AA and similar organizations, they balance their variety equation by saying no, and that they just like trim everything down. And that's definitely something to keep in mind and something to kind of ruminate on, that like there's a definite power in just being able to say no to a problem and saying no, not in scope. We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with this one thing here.
It's also a no and response, right? It's no, this isn't the organization for you, and here's the organization that is will serve your needs, right? Or I guess it's a no but, right? No but is the operation there. So it's not simply a we don't want anything to do with you. It's like, no, we do care about you. We care about your struggle, but this is a more appropriate location for you to engage with it.
And like maybe for like our kind of organizing and like maybe the sort of maybe slightly overcooked example would be like if your workplace union or your unionizing effort is like starting to entertain like, oh, should we also do tenant unionizing? It's like, no, probably not. That should just be a separate organization that handles that, and we coordinate with that other organization when necessary, but you can't stuff everything into one basket, I guess.
Yeah, and I feel like there has to be more talk about this in beer to a point, because it does really get back to that sort of like Maturana and Varela stuff that we were talking about, right? About like, you know, reproduction, speciation, all this kind of stuff that you see in nature. But I think it is true that there isn't a whole lot of discussion in beer about organization, like forking or splitting or anything like that. Yeah, it's actually not something that I've seen covered very much by him.
Yeah, it seems to not be there quite so much. Towards the end of this section, then the author kind of gets to this. I guess it's probably why it's the piece is called "Vital Cells." But gets to a vital principle of organization. So quoting here. A vital principle of organization in which getting organized means following trajectories that allow us to overcome obstacles standing in the way of realizing our potential. So again, that's Spinoza sort of stuff. And like notably, this is like through organization. It's not through sheer acts of self-will. So that's the vital principle that they'll be referring to all the way through. So the cybernetic episteme, what's all this about?
Yeah, so this is a kind of justification for why autonomists need to care about cybernetics. I suppose autonomists or anarchists, leftists more broadly. And the argument essentially is that cybernetics has, over the sort of course of the later 20th century into the 21st century, become a dominant episteme. That is to say, it's a dominant way of thinking about the relationship of the, I guess you would say, individual or your unit of analysis to its environment, right? We think constantly and make use of constantly machines and concepts that are the product of cybernetic thinking. So like, we think about feedback all the time, just like in common sense conversation, right? Like, hey, thanks for the feedback. Can you give me some feedback? All this kind of thing. Like, it's very basic stuff, but also, of course, we're always working with self-regulating machines like I don't know, our oven. We set it to a certain temperature to preheat, and then it heats, and then it lets us know that it's heated, right? Like, it's everywhere. And because it's everywhere, to reject cybernetics as an evil thing, right? A thing that we shouldn't be involved with. Like, there's some autonomists, some anarchists who look at cybernetics primarily in terms of like being systems of top-down control as a kind of like, kind of Heidegger critique of like, this is an enframing of reality, this is oppressive, and so we need to like, kind of create a space apart from cybernetics where we can manifest this Spinozist, vitalist idea of an alternative that isn't conditioned by this inhuman way of thinking. To try to do that sort of thing is kind of just bound to fail because cybernetics is pervasive. And so we have to do immanent critique. We have to do a transcendence of cybernetics from within cybernetics, right? And that means that we have to accept these concepts. We have to accept systems theory. We have to accept cybernetics and design solutions that are towards our goals of growth and flourishing, as opposed to, say, I don't know, like the Facebook algorithm pushing us towards like anti-vaxxer content, right? As just a throwaway example of how cybernetics can be very perverse and manipulative.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it all just kind of like feels like kind of what we've been saying for the last couple of years. That like this is all kind of very resonant with our project here, and like, I think there's a sort of angle that's maybe, I don't know, it's maybe not necessarily missing from the piece, but that one that jumps to mind, that like, I think there's also just it's just a kind of factive nature of like evolutionary ratchets, that like once organisms developed vertebra, like spines, it was fucking game over for like non-vertebrates, you know what I mean? Like, or like once, well, not exactly that, but like, there was, there's a one-way door there that goes to like, you, if you're going to compete on that level, you're going to have to catch up on that level. Maybe vertebra is the wrong example, but like,
yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a good example, because you can get things like, vertebrates becoming organisms that depend on exoskeletons, or vertebrates becoming invertebrates when they go back to the ocean, or like all kinds of like weird stuff can happen in biology based on context changing. But the fact of the matter is, like, there is a kind of fitness about that solution to the problems of, being an organism in like a complex organism in a environment that has to deal with gravity and, complex terrain, that kind of stuff, right? Like, the whales and dolphins are not like bad solutions to living in the sea. They're actually ones that have been able to thrive. But that isn't to say that, like, the amoeba is rendered obsolete by the multicellular organism. In fact, it actually, single cell organisms colonize multicellular organisms, and the context changes and it develops. Yeah.
Yeah, they're doing better than us. Yeah. I think maybe what I was more thinking of is like the kind of Red Queen pressure that happens in evolution, where just the very fact that everything else is moving also means that you have to keep moving, and that like there's no real choice but to catch up with. It's like for listeners who are not familiar, there's like in evolutionary biology, there's this like kind of analogy or like intuition pump they use. Like they're referring to the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, and I think the Red Queen says something like, in order to stay in the same place, you have to run as fast as you can, and if you want to get anywhere, you have to run twice as fast as that. And so in evolution, it's this like, notion that for organisms and for species, the very fact that evolution is ongoing for other organisms and species is a kind of implicit ambient arms race. That, like, even if they're not trying to evolve to get advantage, they have to at least evolve to catch up. And the development of stuff like, maybe in human history we see things like this with the invention of firearms. Like, bow and arrow just doesn't cut it once firearms are on the table.
In almost every circumstance, it's obsolete, right? Like, it's only extreme edge cases, like doing special ops where you have to be very quiet, that you might want to use a crossbow instead of using a gun.
So that's the much better example than vertebra. That's the much better example is like that kind of thing. And like conventional armor is made obsolete by nukes and shit like that. You know, it's you have to catch up.
Yeah.
And I think there's just all these kind of things that, like, once cybernetics was discovered as like a kind of description of things that just happen in the world, whether we know about them or not, and that the people who know about these things and have a science of it gain an advantage by doing that, the whole game just changes, and it's a one-way function. It's a trapdoor function. You can only go through it one way. You can't go back.
That's a very good description, because like, if you are dealing with any kind of complex task, having an adaptive machine is an advantage over having a non-adaptive machine, right? There's still non-adaptive machines, like, a hunting rifle is still an unadaptive machine, right? It's purely mechanical. It doesn't have any real feedback mechanisms. It does the thing that it was designed to do. It does it very well, and it doesn't waste anything by having too much variety, capacity to deal with variety, right? Because you leave that to the hunter. You don't leave that to the gun, right? But if you're talking about a more complex problem, then I want to move a projectile to a point very fast, then you always are going to have an advantage if your machine is adaptive. It's like these days, you can technically design a car that doesn't have all the complex computer systems in it, that manage the brakes, manage the gas, adjust the steering angle here and there dynamically, all using computer technology. But it's never going to be as fast as one that does, because that thing is adapting to things that the driver can't even perceive, right? Like, it's just, you can do that for fun. You could do that to develop driver skill, but if your goal is to have the fastest car to go around a racetrack, you are going to have those technologies in there, because it's simply better at adapting, and the environment that creates is one where, it's like, I don't know, yeah. It's like back in the day when they had rally racing, it used to all be rear-wheel drive cars. Once the all-wheel drive car came out, the rear-wheel drive car couldn't win a rally in a million years. It simply was no longer in contention. If you wanted to have one, you would have to create a separate category.
You go through the trapdoor, and there's no way back through that. The F1 racing is a really good example of that.
Yeah. I mean, F1 is one where there's certain things that are just prescribed out of existence because they don't want to make things too automatic. But other than that, every single time there's a new iteration of a car, every time there's a new year, you have to do that thing of running twice as fast to stay in place, because it's incredibly competitive at like the microsecond kind of margin. Cybernetics does create that kind of environment when you're looking at specific sorts of problem domains. And if you are non-adaptive in an adaptive in a system that is intelligent to the need for adaptation, you are not going to survive.
Yeah, and like the bosses have this stuff, like they have adaptive machines, and that's like firearms against bow and arrows. It's there's no way that sticking to our guns on this is going to make any sense. We have to. It's like, so the author is at pains to kind of draw the distinctions between like the kinds of like from above cybernetics that's useful to empire and to like useful to capital, versus the like cybernetics in general and like bottom up cybernetics, which is kind of different. And like, we can, it's like we can and should make use of these techniques. Firstly, because like, I don't know, things aren't necessarily stained by their use, in one context or another. And also, like, we also don't really have a choice because we can't afford to not catch up.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you were to say follow a strategy of separation and be like the Amish. Well, the Amish have niches that they occupy, but if they were trying to, say, be competitive in the food market, they would have no hope, because their whole thing is that they're deliberately not adapting their farming techniques to the environment. And, they exist in a niche, but they would not become a general sort of approach to farming.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't it seem like a lot of the left is basically structurally like the Amish, I guess, in some way or another, that like just kind of strange holdovers that only survive by limiting contact with the rest of the world, Yeah,
I think so. Like, I think it's like there's sort of micro niches where things like like a Leninist party constitution, like a party constitution based off of Zinoviev, is adaptive, but they're micro niches. They're not actually solutions to the problems that people want to address. And the same thing with like LARPing, the one big union stuff, when like trying to do anarcho-syndicalism in a society where anarcho-syndicalism has no practical basis, right? Which is one of the sort of problems that autonomism is grappling with. One of the problems that it's trying to address is like, okay, anarcho-syndicalism is a nice like organizational form in theory, and it may have been adapted to a particular stage of capitalism, but we don't live in that stage anymore. So if you are doing it, it's kind of more of an affinity group than a meaningful revolutionary organization.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, the other thing that kind of reminds me of that is like the sort of just like withdrawal as the only remaining strategy. It's just like, okay, we can't engage with any of this stuff, so let's just withdraw into.
Right. Yeah. You can become an armchair leftist too, where you just withdraw from the problem entirely as much as you can, and you have an analysis, but you have no meaningful action in relation to your situation.
Yeah. The author, I think, puts it quite nicely and succinctly in saying that cybernetics thus poses the terrain upon which the struggles of the 21st century are to be waged, for better or for worse. It's a nice way of capturing it. He also invokes one of the little bits of Deleuze that I quite like, that like we don't actually have a choice between the more brutish regime or the more virtuous regime. Like, we are trapped in this fucking thing, and it's a conflict between enslaving and liberating forces within the regime. Like, which threads can we pull on? What kinds of things can we do within this context that could move us somewhere else? I think the way Deleuze puts it is that like you look around on the ground for whatever weapons are available and you pick the fucking things up,
Yes. But you pick them up in a deliberate, critical way, as opposed to just saying, everyone's jumping off a bridge, so I will too. You know, like that's the difference. And I think like this stuff about power and control is interesting. Power, control, and discipline, right? These are the things that they talk about. So obviously control is an inherent notion in cybernetics, right? Like that's what it's all about. And discipline is something that is implied by structure, right? And then power is something that I think there's some degree of interest in cybernetics, but it isn't integral to the analysis, really, right? Like it's kind of like, this is the problem you get with like actor network theory, where I remember Feenberg, a professor of mine who we covered on the show, he was in a lecture, or he was in a seminar with Latour. He was in one of Latour's seminars, and he sort of brought up this issue of power, right, of ideology and power, and he's like, oh, we don't talk about that here. Like that like these relationships are all symmetrical.
Ay, what the fuck?
And there's no, we don't talk about asymmetry, we don't talk about power. And that can be a huge blind spot of cybernetics, because you can do a cybernetic analysis in that mode, even though I wouldn't say it's very good cybernetics. I think another one that you might look at is the way that cybernetics has been operationalized in like conventional action research, where it's action research in the interests of management. So it tries to portray itself in a very like apolitical sense, but it's actually about management control over workers. Whereas then you have like critical action research, which is actually, you know, this kind of cybernetics from below approach, right? Where you acknowledge that power exists and think about it, as opposed to bracketing it out of your analysis.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's I don't know, it's like that thing of just like taking these things seriously. Like take if you were seriously concerned with power and its distribution, like you then have to take all this other stuff seriously.
Yeah, and I think this is important too, because like I was thinking back to our discussion on It Could Happen Here, and I was thinking about that point I made about what was it, that the current systems we live in tend to be quite infantilizing, and they create a kind of, a sort of a psychologically disempowered subject, right? One that's inherently submissive because it's childlike, and irresponsible because it's never been taught to be responsible. Yeah, and then I was thinking about like, well, maybe a little bit too much of a simple analysis of the problem, because we kind of then get into this sort of leftist thing about valorizing power and its usage over other ways of being, right? So like I'm thinking, for example, I think like, you know, to get sort of to the Foucault stuff that's behind some of this, like there's kind of the discussion in like feminism about like, well, you know, if you are feminist, but you have a hostility to being femme because it's seen as an inherently oppressed mode of being, that is kind of an incomplete analysis of femininity, right? Of the problem space of feminism. And similarly, like, we shouldn't demand of everybody that they take on this, like, I don't want to say mature, but managerial, empowered, sort of alpha role. And if they don't, they're not good leftists, right? And it's you know, it's another thing that's come up in like BDSM, right? Is like, because you have dominants and submissives in BDSM doesn't mean that the dominant has a license to be abusive outside of the consensual boundaries of the relationship, nor does it mean that the submissive is not valued equally within that relationship, right? And if you're doing either of those things, if you're breaking either of those conditions, then that's just an abusive relationship. So I wouldn't want to encourage us to think about power in such a way where it's like, oh yeah, power is about everybody being a dom. Mm-hmm. Power is about everybody being dominant and having a constitution of desire where they desire dominance. You know, we should have, like, I don't think it's pathological to be ambivalent about the exercise of power in that way, or to wish to be under the power of another in a way that is consensual and healthy and not abusive, right? Because, you know, there's a kind of power to that as well, right? Like, if you are a submissive, there's a power to that. It's just not expressed in the same way. So it's really important that we don't sort of say like, oh yeah, everybody needs to be mask, everybody needs to be dominant, everybody needs to be, you know, mature, even if you're a child. We should like have some more nuanced thinking about these things when we're talking about like control systems and the organizations of our movement.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's all super interesting. It reminds me of a couple of workplaces ago. We did this thing of like trying to, you know, get the engineers more autonomy and more kind of decision making and stuff. And I actually worked with an engineer who was just like, yeah, I don't give a shit. just tell me what to do and I'll do the work, and then I'll drop my pickaxe on the floor at 5 and go home. You know, it's just like pretty strongly didn't want to like have any of that responsibility. It's just like not something he was really interested in doing, which was refreshing, you know?
Yeah. And the thing there is like, is not to say, oh, but you must assume this position, this subjectivity, this psychology, you must be this kind of desiring machine that, you know, we have mandated is the only acceptable one. It's more to say, well, but is that what you really want? Do you really want to be completely subaltern? Do you really want to be completely disempowered? And the answer is probably no. The answer is probably, oh, well, I want to be governed by another power, but I want to be governed in a way that is consensual and healthy for me, and not one that is actually completely arbitrary and which I have no say over.
Yeah. I suspect in this this colleague's case, it was just that the decision-making process, like the management process, was just skull-crushing tedium, and he was just like, I'm not fucking doing any of that stuff. It's a horrible... Being stuck in meetings forever is horrible, so I'm just gonna nope out of it. But yeah, it's worth interrogating why somebody responds in a particular way to this, yeah.
Yeah, and exactly, and it's like, you know, it's a stereotype, but like... It's characteristic of people who are submissive that they just don't enjoy power like that. Like, it's like, I don't want to make decisions. I don't want to be involved in making decisions, and I don't want to enforce decisions.
Yeah, decisions suck.
Because none of these things bring me pleasure. They're all miserable.
I guess that's all super important, and it's an important corrective for... I guess, like, I mean, the fact that we talk about decision and, like, decision-making processes so much, and, like, it's such a central part of, like, this whole research program, it's like, you'd be at risk of valorizing it too much and forgetting that, like, no, work sucks, and, like, deciding things about work sucks too, and, yeah.
Well, it sucks if it's not your thing, right? If in the constitution of your desires to do those things, then it sucks. But, some people actually really like that. Given certain constraints and and environments, contexts, all of these qualifications, actually enjoy being the leader, being in power, making decisions, all of these things. And that's okay, right? It's just that recognizing that people have different, constitutions of desire, and that this is a thing you have to take it into account when you're designing a system that is meant to be both equitable but also enjoyable for the people who are within it. Because, it's no good to live in utopia if utopia is something you hate. These characters that you get in the culture books who are Banks always makes fun of them, and for good reason. But these extreme examples of people who are I can't fit into this culture because it just doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah, yeah.
If that means you are actually in, Accession, somebody who is only interested in being in a abusive society where you're on top, that's not acceptable, okay, or should it be valorized, right? But in most cases, there are accommodations and ways to adapt to that, as opposed to just saying, oh no, everybody needs to be somebody in special circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God, can you imagine in our wonderful cyber Marxist utopia just being marched into your the fucking workers' council meeting at gunpoint to be you must participate in worker democracy and shit,
Well, but this is something that was kind of in a way characteristic of Marxist Leninist states, where it's in North Korea when they have those massive displays that they do, right? And you have to perform enthusiasm for the government, for the society, for the regime, for being a collective, or the idea that you must vote in the election, and even though the election is rigged. There is a kind of the focus of Leninist thought on heroic voluntarism does imply a kind of mandatory heroism that becomes empty because it isn't something that is in accordance with people's desires or psychologies.
Yeah, totally. I would also say that kind of mandatory heroism stuff is absolutely fucking pervasive through, autonomism, anarchism, all this kind of stuff. That's something that's super relatable from my time in a more kind of anarchist milieu. I don't know,
It's also very funny because it's something that is really not characteristic of militaries. If you're in the trenches and you're doing trench life, from what I've read of first-hand accounts of soldiers in World War I, there were people that were recognized as being heroic, and people had a certain kind of appreciation for that, but it absolutely was not expected of people to be that way, because it was recognized that was definitely something that only applied to outliers, and they had a particular kind of psychology that an average person who was expected to live in a trench with bombs going off over their head all the time just would not have and couldn't possibly be expected to have. The camaraderie that was characteristic of those situations was a far cry from the idea that, oh no, we all need to be super activists, right?
Yeah, totally. I'm just now thinking of Blackadder, and they're trying to get away from the trenches at every moment.
Totally. Or even if you just had a blasé attitude about the situation, that was completely normal and accepted for whatever it was normal in that horrific situation. But it was still a situation of incredibly high stress, and nevertheless one in which people were not expected to be something completely different from what they actually were.
Well, like for Blackadder, it was like for Blackadder it was extremely high stress, but then for Hugh Laurie's character, it was like he was a bit too silly to really appreciate the danger of the situation. And then you have Melchett who's just like 30 miles from the front anyway. Yeah, I don't know. Fun show. Anyway, to close out this section, there's just one little bit I want to read at the end here that I think puts it quite nicely. There is no outside to governmentality, just as the project of governing is always incomplete. Either we cede the space of cybernetic systems to our enemies, to those who keep us down, or we create mechanisms by which regulatory processes are imminent to our own vitality. Yeah, pretty good. Nice way to sum it up.
Yes, exactly. And like part of the vitalism of Deleuzianism or Spinozism is that, your desires and your vitality go hand in hand, right? That if you're authentically existing according to your nature, your immanent nature, then your desires and your vitality are both going to be flourishing together.
Yeah, totally. They're all about that flourishing. The next section then is two forms of faith, which I guess just gets into the critique of the milieu, and also like it also draws a comparison with like wellness culture in the general bourgeois culture, and these both suck. Is kind of the conclusion. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, the milieu kind of like he's just tearing into his own crowd here, and and again, it's all familiar because I kind of came out of some of this stuff, and like it gives great voice to these kind of problems that like the kind of structuring our kind of efforts around this like radical scene, which is just like buddy system, like small groups of friends standing apart from society. It doesn't work out, right? Like just totally skipping out on debates over organization or like things like that, just like taking a total non-position on strategy and organization. That's not viable. You end up with a very hollow kind of autonomy. Like it's very isolating. And I think the very crucial point here is that all that sort of stuff, and again, this author is reflecting on their own experiences here and like really calling out we have to come to a conclusion that this stuff hasn't and doesn't foster our capacities for us and our comrades. It just doesn't. We run into these barriers over and over again. Comrades burn out and they walk away. That's how this works out.
Yes, and they also talk here about the tyranny of structuralistness, which we've covered on our anarchist cybernetics episode already, I guess. But one thing I did want to say is that it's one thing to enjoy exercising power in very external obvious ways, but in a structuralist situation, it also tends to be the case that the people who do actually accumulate power are sociopaths, and so you want structures that, yes, they can allow you to operate in a non-dominant mode, but also ensure that the people who are dominant are not sociopaths. Because that is the position that they most enjoy being in, and as a matter of course cause harm to everybody else. And I've seen that many times across organizations that you need defense capabilities against people who exercise, like narcissists, sociopaths, people who exercise power in an abusive manner, and a structuralist organization does not actually prevent that from happening.
No, totally right. Because like the structure, you could have structure that would inoculate you against that kind of stuff. In fact, like to be inoculated against lunatics would require structure. That's the hinge point there.
Yeah, it's kind of like when Beer talks about how the higher levels of the VSM are services for the System Ones. Like they you know, the core is the autonomy of the System Ones, and then you have these services on top of it that allow it to adapt to situations and become and flourish. It's not that you have managers on top who are bossing everyone else around.
Yeah. The points then about the wellness culture are kind of interesting, and I guess they also mirror like the problems of the milieu, right? That like in the general culture, this wellness stuff is very individual. Like the individual is supposed to just kind of like fix themselves and isolate themselves from the bad stuff in the world, which it's more obvious how that would go wrong with the wellness stuff, but then you then recognize it as having a lot in common with the way the kind of milieu works, right? Like, no, we're going to isolate ourselves from the bad stuff in the world. We're just going to kind of will our way out of it. We're going to, I don't know, just be more virtuous on our own and our little group of buddies.
You have like these spaces of safety and domesticity within which wellness is meant to be cultivated. So like yoga studios or retreats or the domestic space, like, oh, I'm doing this interior decorating because it's creating a safe haven for me within which I can be well. And then there is the sort of second order of this, which is the performance of ideal selves and ideal standards of wellness by influencers on social media. Good vibes only. And you get a kind of community, like the quote unquote wellness community, which is people imitating these standards of wellness. So people who go to yoga class together but don't have any meaningful connection to one another, people who have parasocial relationships with that girl influencers on Instagram or whatever. It is and then of course the influencers themselves become alienated from themselves because they have to 24/7 perform this standard of discipline that is about being the ideal self for the camera, for the audience, as opposed to being a community member in a meaningful sense. So it's pretty gross stuff. I also had a lot of discussions with I had a discussion the other day with Bob Neubauer about how like there's a lot of like anti-vax stuff in these wellness communities, and I think that, and we were talking about like sort of the individualism that is inherent to the communities, where it's like, yes, we have a particular kind of, I guess you would say in like the terms that they use here, extrinsic relationship to one another. But it's really about all of us working on ourselves. So like we are apart together, right? And we're all working on our own individual standard of wellness, our own particular body. And somehow this kind of coincides with a like libertarian hostility to any idea of social responsibility, any idea of social wellness, and any idea of collective belonging and care. So it's not everybody in the wellness world that would fall into that description, certainly, but many do, and I think they're operating in that kind of mode that they're describing here in this article.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right. And I don't. It's the parallels between the wellness stuff and the milieu stuff are like very interesting, and like I don't know, like how many people are going to get so kind of upset at this sort of like comparison, I guess, that like because it's very like that kind of like new left sort of thing of, hey, look, if we all just have a personal revolution and we all do it, then we're going to have a revolution, you know? If everyone changed all at once, then everything would change, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, so on the one hand, you have Instagram influencers and they're like, you know, perfectly done up sort of houses with the like no bad vibes shit tacked on the walls. And then on the parallel is, you know, people who fetishize living in squats, and you know, going you can kind of draw parallels across the boundary there, which is very funny and weird. But they both have this underlying pathology of modernity, right? Late modernity, this subjectivity.
Yeah, it's like if you took like the heroic example of Mandela in prison and his resilience to the oppression that he was put under, and we're like, no, everybody needs to exhibit that same degree of inner strength and discipline related simply to their career and existence in capitalism. And if you don't, then clearly you're just defective, right? Like on the one hand, it's about a collective struggle. It's about, you know, this his heroic resilience. On the other hand, it's about an extreme level of discipline in regards to something that is incredibly mundane, and unwarranted, right? Like to put yourself through 24/7 discipline just so that you can be a better careerist, just so that you can maybe if you're super lucky become petty bourgeois or bourgeois, and that's the standard of your dream, of your faith, of the horizon of your existence. It's like, why should we be heroic about the most bland shit imaginable, you know?
Yeah. Like, if you adopt the Sigma grind set, you can be the guy who runs the used chainsaw dealership with the roof tiles falling off. You can get there. It's not much to aspire to, I guess. Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can follow us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on the internet at generalintellectunit.net. And you can find us on all the podcast apps. So like, rate, and subscribe. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit, you can throw us a couple of bucks a month to help the show and to get access to our community Discord. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Swampside Chats, From Alpha to Omega, Mortal Science, and Jumpsuit Utopia. They are all excellent shows and excellent folks. In other news, Kyle and I recently appeared on an episode of It Could Happen Here. We recommend you go check out that show and that episode. I also appeared on a recent episode of Auxiliary Statements. Likewise, we recommend you go check out that show. As always, thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll join us again next time.